Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. Thank you so much for being here today. We're going to be looking at over 280 photographs of the asylums that existed in America in the mid-19th century. And these asylums are absolutely fascinating. If you're familiar with them at all, then you will know that in America there were hundreds, if not thousands, of these massive, castle-like, ornate asylums that were being founded all throughout the country. What makes this even more fascinating is that we're told at the height of these mental hospitals, these insane asylums in America, they housed over 500,000 patients, but they began to diminish in size as new methods of treatment became available. Yet, by the year 1890, we're also told that every state in America had built one or more of these publicly supported mental hospitals, these insane asylums. They were all still expanding in size as the country's population continued to grow. And according to this narrative, all of this was spearheaded by one woman, Dorothea Dix, who was a school teacher from New England. She became the most prominent voice, quote unquote, and the most visible presence in the campaign to create mental hospitals all throughout the country. Now, why this is fascinating to me, all of these mental hospitals are so lavish, they're so ornate, they are so massive, and they are all built, at least 95% of them are built with just masonry. There is not steel here, even though these were constructed during the Industrial Revolution. We're not looking at steel or iron or anything of a modern design. These are all old world masonry style massive pieces of architecture, the same type of architecture that would be deemed obsolete just a few decades later, which would make these buildings very convenient for the inheritors, for the governments that would then take them over once these buildings were abandoned. I also found it to be absolutely fascinating when we consider that we have this person, Dorothea Dix, a school teacher, who we're told became the most prominent voice for funding and getting these asylums constructed. But we also have to look at what was occurring within the mental asylum, the insane asylum of America in the 19th century, because they essentially functioned as an early form of public education. And it makes you wonder, because in the 19th century, many areas, most areas in America did not have a free public education. There was no K through 12 that would lead you down the path to finding your career. It almost appears as if these mental asylums played a role in introducing public education to the country, as if these asylums were a preview of what was to come. As we dive deeper into this collection, there are a few different points of contention that I wanted to point out to you. Just a little bit of food for thought for you to think about before we get into this collection a little bit further, before we look at the images of these mental asylums in America in the 19th century. One thing is that a lot of these asylums had the finest amenities available at that time, including, I read, at least 1/3 of these asylums had their own private railways. Essentially, they would bring those that were being committed, as well as those who were visiting, those who were committed, the families of those who were committed. But we also have these private railways bringing in the workers and things like that. But they also functioned to export the materials that were being created within these asylums, because many, if not all, of the asylums of the 19th century also functioned as businesses. Essentially, they had those who were committed into the asylum put to work, and often they were creating goods that were then exported out of the asylum and then sold, and then these profits would benefit the asylum itself, would also benefit the governments, the states who owned these asylums. So I found that to be really fascinating, because many consider these asylums to be really ornate yet private locations that were very shielded off from the public, and this is true in most instances. But at the same time, these asylums also functioned as businesses where those who were there were put to work, and they were producing things that would gain even more income, even more profit. So not only were we essentially, quote unquote, helping those who had mental need, but we were also essentially privately lining the pockets of those who owned these asylums. And I found that to be very revealing in this narrative. Another thing that I found to be so fascinating is that in some instances we have these asylums and they are in what are considered to be very important cities today, the largest cities in America. And in these cases, many times the asylums were not actually abandoned or torn down, but they were modernized. The foundations of these asylums were used to create new hospitals, and in that sense, many of these asylums do still survive today, albeit they are not the same architecture, not the same design that they originally were, but their locations, their foundations remain the same as in places like Austin, Texas, and Indianapolis. However, we also have smaller locations, smaller towns by population, where these asylums were constructed. Absolutely massive buildings, but just small little towns in the middle of nowhere where these asylums were constructed. And essentially, these towns lived and died by the asylum itself. So when these asylums were abandoned in the 20th and 21st century, many of them were left in a state of disrepair, and then the surrounding community basically seemed to vanish as the community within the asylum vanished as well. You can see that many of the more obscure towns, I'm not talking about when we look at the asylums here that are in large towns, large cities that you are familiar with, but when they are in the smaller portions of the state, and we see these town names that you may not have heard before, when you see the asylums in those locations, just know that many times the towns have not been developed since the fall of the asylum. They have become like ghost towns. So I found that to be absolutely fascinating, because we really see that these asylums were essentially one of, if not the most important thing to the workforce in the late 19th century. We also have what I found to be a really interesting tidbit. It sort of goes against the grain, because in multiple photographs here, not every photograph, because again, we're focused on the architecture, and it appears that when these photographs were taken, these postcards were sent, etc., the focus was on the architecture. But in a handful of these photographs, in the photographs where we do see people in the photograph, in the image, it seems like the people are happy. They're dressed in regular, what we would consider to be 19th century attire. They do not seem to have any restrictions on them. There are no fences holding anyone into these structures. It appears that, for lack of a better term, these insane asylums were full functioning communities where the people within truly don't appear to be in any sort of state of mental disarray. That's what I found to be so interesting about this. Is part of the reason we're told that many of these asylums were shut down, all of this glorious architecture. At the time, what I could only imagine was the finest architecture being built in the United States. We're told many of these mental asylums, insane asylums, were shut down because of their mistreatment of the people that were being committed there. We have people being locked in their room, people not being fed enough, people being strapped down, people going through electric shock therapy, etc. All of these things that were considered to be mistreatment eventually led to the insane asylums of America being shut down. But when we look at the photographs, at least the ones that I was able to find, when these photographs do include people, it appears that every single person within the grounds of these mental asylums is a regular functioning human being. And it's so fascinating to me, because behind closed doors, we have the idea that these mental asylums essentially were functioning as businesses. They were giving people the opportunity to join a workforce, or some sort of workforce, some sort of community where they would have repetition and they would be able to serve some sort of purpose. They would be able to have a job. They would be able to produce something that would then be exported from the asylum. So again, these asylums served as businesses. When we look at the asylum photographs, the people within the asylum appeared to be regular people who were just looking to get by, people who were functioning, people who were conducting business, people who were dressed in regular 19th century attire. Nothing about the people, the patients in these photographs, makes them stand out as mentally incapable of functioning in society. It appears as though the mental asylum, the label that was placed upon these buildings, was simply that, a label. But what was going on inside the asylum was a lot more like a business. Now, I'll digress on that for a moment, But what it does lead us to is the orphan trains of America, or the massive amount of orphans that existed in America in the 19th century. For example, in New York City alone, we have over 100,000 orphans by the mid-19th century. And these orphans were all around the country. So just imagine all of those who were not reported, because we're taking the numbers accepted by the current narrative, but we must understand that in the 19th century, the numbers were overwhelmingly underreported on the African American and the indigenous American community, the exact communities that were essentially being the most affected by this asylum system and by the almshouses, by the orphan system. So we have to ask, why exactly were there so many orphans in America at this time period? And when we consider the mental asylums, the insane asylums, we must also consider that the orphan systems of America bled directly into the mental asylum systems of America. And it was all, I believe, revolving around the idea of producing a new workforce, a workforce that would be complicit in the ideas of the American past. Asylums were used to control the narrative, and these hospitals were the most elegant structures and buildings of their time period, especially when they were popping up in these communities that had little to nothing before the asylum arrived there. They were being placed in indigenous communities that were already being wiped out. They were being affected by disease and by the European settlers. And then to put a cherry on top of everything, the European settlers were then setting up massive, insane asylums, mental asylums, basically these large places where they could take in refugees, where they could take in people that did not have another way, the same people who they forced into needing asylum. They were then giving them asylum in these asylums that were built in the Kirkbride system, built in the system that essentially made the building resemble a castle. Why was all of this? Because if you have a small child, if you have someone who is easily influenced, if you have someone who has been put through such hardships that they can simply not get by, and then you show them a castle-like structure, you tell them that once inside the castle, they will be completely provided for, they will have a job, they will have a purpose, and beyond that, if they can convince others around them, they will have their family there with them as well. Do you not think that numerous groups, large families of indigenous Americans, African Americans, those who were disenfranchised in America, do you not think that they were turning to these asylums and embracing them with open arms? And do you not know that this is part of the reason why the history of the asylum system, the mental asylum, the insane asylum in America, this is why the history is so compartmentalized, because it greatly affects what we are looking to hide. Not we, not me. I'm looking to uncover it. But we as a whole, as an American society, is part of our past that we have looked to cover over for hundreds of years. So why would the current narrative ever allude to what was actually going on? The insane asylums of America are one of the most revealing aspects of 19th century history. Extrapolating on this further, when we look at the population numbers, as I mentioned earlier, the population of America around the year 1890 was just over 60 million people. Now, the population of the American insane asylum at this time was just over 600,000 people. So we're looking at roughly 1% of the entire population of America was being held inside mental or insane asylums at this time. Now, that number doesn't seem high, but for a population, that is so many people. And when we look at this even further, when we consider what I just mentioned, the disenfranchised groups of the year 1890 and even before that, because people started being thrown or institutionalized, thrown into these asylums in the early 1800s as they began to pop up in Pennsylvania. But beyond that, when we look at the overall numbers, when we look at the disenfranchised group, African Americans, indigenous Americans in 1890, the numbers being held within these asylums could be even higher because these asylums were being used to control the narrative. If you disagreed with what was going on, if you disagreed with the history that was being placed upon you, if you disagreed with what the government was doing, this is where you would end up. But it makes it even more fascinating that the government, we're told, was choosing to create these asylums, these mental hospitals, as the most elegant structures, the most elegant buildings of their time period. Essentially, in many of the small towns where these asylums were popping up, they were the finest structures to have ever existed in those towns, even until this day. And it was all built around the Kirkbride system. So the question becomes, who is Kirkbride? And we have this gentleman, essentially a pioneer of mental health, who decided that to fix someone's mental state, the best thing to do was essentially to put them in a castle, to put them into a structure, these absolutely massive buildings, and they were almost always built to be symmetrical if they were truly using the Kirkbride system. So they would have these offshoots, these corridors on either side of the main structure, but essentially they were built to be castles. And these castles were meant to uplift people simply by the fanciness, simply by the ornate structure, simply by the feng shui of the design. Where are all the construction photographs? We are told that most of the asylums, the hospitals that we are looking at today, being the most elegant structures, the most elegant buildings at their time, and with hundreds, if not thousands of them already existing in the mid-1800s, even before we had annexed most of the West, we have hundreds of these asylums existing in America. The question becomes, where are all of the construction photographs? Where are even the photographs of when they renovated these structures? Where are the images showing the actual masonry being built? Because what we have are massive pieces of engineering. In some instances, what appear to be the largest buildings in their town, the largest buildings in their city, possibly the largest buildings in their state. But at the same time, we do not have any relevant information on the construction of these buildings, of the construction of these mental asylums. These works of engineering were so much different, we're told, than everything else that was being built at that time period. We have other structures that wanted to incorporate steel and iron and any sort of technique that would help to build faster and to reduce cost. But when we're looking at the Kirkbride style mental asylums, the hundreds, if not thousands of them that existed in America, almost every single time they were built to be lavish. They were built to be ornate. They were not built to be put up quickly and to stand for a short amount of time. They were built to withstand the test of time and to look like something out of a fairy tale. So the question becomes why? And where are the construction photographs? Every single blueprint for these buildings should be available. The blueprints should be basically designed with the Kirkbride style in mind. So where are the architects themselves, the builders, the horses, the machinery, the equipment, etc.? The population numbers of these asylums was so epic. Who decided who was actually being institutionalized at this time? And why is it that so many of these hospitals and asylums, the mental hospitals, were being built upon previous structures, were being built upon indigenous sites, indigenous burial sites, indigenous meeting sites, indigenous trading sites, and then the same indigenous people whose land was being taken over to build the asylum were then being forced inside of it. These asylums were also being built upon natural phenomena like hot springs. The asylums were essentially the castles of America, but within these castles, who was actually seeking asylum? By the 1950s, the death knell for psychiatric asylums had sounded. A new system of nursing home would meet the needs of vulnerable elders. A new medication offered hopes of curing the most persistent and severe of psychiatric symptoms. And a new system of mental health care, the community mental health system, would return those suffering from mental illnesses to their families and their communities. By the year 1950, the Kirkbride-style mental asylum was considered obsolete. A big thank you to asylumprojects.org and to asylumpostcards.com, both of which were resources that helped me out a lot in doing this research, looking for photographs to be able to share with you. The consensus appears to be, no matter what side of the field you are standing on, is that there are not enough construction photographs of these massive asylums. we should have many more construction photographs, as we're told that throughout the 1800s, really from 1812 throughout the end of the century, we have hundreds of these asylums that were being constructed, being founded all throughout America. And when they were founded, for some reason, no one thought to take any construction photographs. So that is why I find this history to be so fascinating. Everything about it, from the hiding of the narrative, the retelling of the narrative, to over 1% of our population being held inside these asylums, to the asylums being used to cover up and rewrite indigenous and African American history, to the asylums themselves being built so lavishly, like castles, so ornate, symmetrically built off of these blueprints. It's so fascinating to think that this idea swept over the entire country to the point that every single state, the government was putting a lot of their money, some would say all of their money, into these structures. So essentially, from the early 1800s through the end of the 1800s, every state had built one of these massive asylums. Many states had dozens of them or more. They all continued to expand in size into the mid-20th century, when they were eventually all shut down. Dorothea Dix was a New England schoolteacher who became the prominent face and voice of this movement to have all of these Kirkbride asylums built throughout the country. It's a very questionable narrative. They were all masonry, they were not steel, at least 95% of them were masonry, and this is the type of architecture, this masonry-only architecture, that was considered obsolete by the 1920s and 30s. So it was convenient for those that would then inherit these buildings and turn them into something more modern. These asylums appeared to be a preview of the public education system that would take over the United States in the 1900s, and the asylums had many amenities, including their own private railways in at least a third of them. The remote locations and towns, these obscure asylums, are in these locations that seem to have not been developed since these asylums shut down. This is not all the asylums, just a few of the more obscure ones. Multiple of these asylums seem to have residents that are not kept there by any means. There are no fences or anything like that, and all of the people appear to be happy, dressed in normal 19th century clothing. We're going through every single one of these photographs. They should be labeled in the bottom left or right hand of every photograph. Sometimes it'll be at the top, but all of these should be labeled photographs so you know exactly what mental institution you are looking at. I can't wait to hear which one stands out to you the most in the comment section down below. If you want to reach out to me to support the channel, to help the channel to grow, there's a link in my YouTube profile, but sharing and liking these videos also helps me immensely. I have hundreds of other videos with tens of thousands of other photographs for you to satiate your appetite of the old world. I can't wait to hear from you, and we will talk again on the next video. But do not click off this video, because we have so much architecture within here, architecture that really makes America look so much different than you might have expected it to look when we consider the finest, most remote architecture of our land. I've tried to include a photograph of an asylum from every state in the United States of America, and the only states that I was unable to find 19th century photographs of the asylums would be Alaska and Hawaii. However, we're going to be diving deeper into this collection, so save these images if any of them stand out to you the most. Let me know which image stands out to you the most and why down below in the comment section. Let me know what you think about the current narrative in regards to all of the massive asylums that were being founded around America. And most of all, stay tuned, because we'll be talking about this a lot more in videos to come.